Hello, everyone. Welcome to the beginning Bible study on the book of John. We're going to spend a long time, it'll take a while, to work through all of the book of John, studying it and examining it and letting it apply to us, let it dissect us, let it help us grow as Christians. But I want to also take some time in this introduction to talk about John himself, the beginning of John, and sort of like even a big picture look at John as we take and examine this beginning to the study on the book of John. Before I dive into that, let's just look at some things about John. This book was written in 80 to 90 A.D. So it was one of the later writings. The other Gospels had already been composed and were being distributed throughout the church. People would have been familiar with them. John would have probably been familiar with them by the time he writes his Gospel account, and it would be the last ones. And it would be one of the latter writings of the Bible, by the way. It wouldn't be the last, but one of the latter things written for the Bible. And therefore, we see that it differs a little bit, which we'll talk about. By this time, the temple has fallen. It's believed that he wrote after the temple fell. No longer is there temple worship by the Jews with the sacrificial system. It was gone. And even itself, Jerusalem was in crumbles. And John had left the nation of Israel and was now living in the city of Ephesus at the time of this writing, many believe. So we understand that the writing was a bit after the Gospels. Even Paul had been writing to this point. So there was those letters circulating as well throughout the church. Now, also in Jesus' time, John was his disciple. John was one of the elite disciples. He was of the elite three of James, his brother, John's brother, not Jesus' brother. They both had brothers named James, but the elite three was James, who was kin to John, his brother, the sons of Zebedee is what they're referred to, or Thunder, and Peter. Those were the elite three that got to do more with Jesus than the others. Remember, they went to the Mount of Transfiguration. They were there when Jesus was transfigured, and he was speaking to Moses and Elijah, and they heard the booming voice of God speak to them. That was the three that were able to experience this, and John was one of them. John was also young at the time. He was one of the youngest disciples at the time. He would live to be the oldest. He would be the longest living one that would live into, I believe, his 80s. Some maybe even think he lived to 90, but he's in that ballpark of living a very long life and finishing it off in the town of Ephesus, as we understand, where he would move to and live and spend most of his time and his life. There's a few things about him that we often miss. He was the one that Jesus loved, because often we see it in the Lord's Supper's pictures. The disciple that is laying on the chest of Jesus is John. So we have to understand Jesus has literally heard the heartbeat of God, because he's recorded as being the one that leans up against Jesus' chest and was that close to him. But John has a few more things that sets him apart even from the other disciples. One is in the courtyard where Peter would deny Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed. John was there. It's believed John was there, and John was the disciple that actually snuck Peter in so Peter could be there to deny Jesus, as far as that goes. So John was in the courtyard as the trial was had, as sort of the made-up charges were being pressed against Jesus. But we also know that John was the only disciple at the cross, because Jesus looked down from the cross to John and said, "This is your mother, take care of her," talking about the mother Mary, the mother of Jesus. But what we recollect, he did take her into his household, because she would pass away in Ephesus, as would he. So they did pass away in the small same town of Ephesus, looking at it. So if we take a look at John the person, we can see that John may have been the closest to Jesus, the closest out of them all, the one that knew him the best, the one that knew the most about him than any other person, even within the disciples or to exist on this earth. And he would even be privileged later, after writing this, many people believe. Some believe this may have been written after Patmos, but most believe it was written before Patmos. But on the island of Patmos, where he had the experience of revelation, he took and got to see the throne room of Jesus Christ, the only living human being that got experience. I don't know, but you can read in Revelation and see the beauty of the throne room. And he was able to see it. We will not see it until we pass away and make it to heaven. But he was allowed to in that vision. And we know, of course, he was the one that would be exiled to Patmos. What happened was the Roman ruler of that day, was afraid of John because he was the last living disciple of Jesus Christ, a very powerful. Knew that he needed to get John out of the way because his voice was powerful in the community. So he chose to exile him to the island of Patmos just to isolate him so he couldn't cause any trouble, any uproar, because he had that much influence within the Roman Empire, being a witness to Jesus Christ and potentially his best friend, if you think about it. So they put him there. Now, he did not die there. He would spend time there, and he would leave and definitely compose 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, which is attributed to him, and the book of Revelation after he was off of. Now, granted, he may have written Revelation while he was sitting on Patmos, but it's believed that the release and the sort of, I guess, sending out of that message came after he was off of the island, Patmos. So he was there, political prisoner, really, because he was so influential in that time. And would later be released, and he would be in Ephesus near Patmos, and off the sort of coastline there near it. And he would be there. And he would write that. But also while he was there, and before when he was there, he evidently wrote this book we call the Gospel of John. Now, before we dive into the Gospel of John and looking at it, I want to ask a very thoughtful question. The question is, what is the toughest question you have ever answered? What's the toughest question you've ever answered? I'm saying, maybe the toughest question was, who am I going to be when I grow up? We all sort of go through that when we're younger. That's a big question. Who am I going to marry? I mean, that's an important question that you ask yourself in your life, and it can hold strong weight on your life. Another one might be, and if you're in a tough situation, maybe you're dealing with a health battle or your financial problems, how am I going to survive this? You know, those are deep moments when you're asking a very deep word. Or maybe it's as simple as, who drank all the milk? You ever had that screamed at you from the kitchen, and you're in another room? Who drank all the milk? Oh my goodness. Do I have to answer that? But we do face tough questions. And I believe that the book of John is guiding us to a very deep question that we want to look at. Now, we'll get to that question in a moment, but I want to take a look at some of chapter 1 of the book of John and just read some of it, and then we're going to examine it. Well, of course, we're going to look at it all over in detail. We're not going to take it in full chapter sections. We'll take it piece by piece. But I kind of want to read a decent amount of 1 to let it give us some reasoning and where I believe John is taking us as a whole through the book of John. So I'm going to start in verse 1 of John chapter 1, the Gospel. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness shall not comprehend it. There came a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness, and this is John the Baptist, by the way. He came as a witness to testify about the light so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. There was the true light, which coming into the world enlightened every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God. Even so, those who believed in his name, who were born not of the blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory as the glory of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified about him and cried out, saying, This was he of whom I said, He who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for I existed before him. For of his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace, truth, and were realized through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten of God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. And then it goes on to look at the testimony of John, still in chapter 1. And then it looks at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, picking of the disciples in chapter 1 of the Gospel of John. Now, I want to examine that for a minute, so that we can sort of see this direction I think that John is taking us in. And I want to look at it kind of like an investigator or scientist, if you will, and see if we can gain some understanding here. First, if we're examining it, let's ask this question. What is missing from the beginning of John? Now, to do that, we need to look at the other Gospels, obviously, of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, Luke really just picks up, Mark picks up in the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. It doesn't have anything. But Matthew and Luke record Jesus' birth. We celebrate that at Christmas. We have the Christmas story. We have Jesus in the manger. We have Mary's story. We spend probably the biggest Christian holiday season of Christmas, taking and thinking about how Jesus came to earth and was born in a manger. And also usually included in those two, fairly early in their writing of Matthew and Luke, is the genealogy of Jesus. So we have to ask the question, it's not here. It's not in the Gospel of John. It's not recorded. So why did he do it? Why did he not record the events of the birth and the genealogy of Jesus? Well, I don't think he didn't care, because, that would mean he wouldn't care about Mary, who he would have looked like take care of, and she would pass away in Ephesus with him in that same town. So I believe that, he was taking care of her, so I don't think he was throwing it out. I think he was writing for a different purpose, because those were widely circulated. Everybody kind of already had Matthew and Luke and, of course, Mark, and it's believed that that part is well known and is not up for, I'd say, debate or discussion or trouble to talk about. So he's going for something else. He's heading in a different direction than the other three. So then let's ask the next question. What does it contain? What is listed here? Well, there's an interesting description of Jesus. Totally different than the other Gospels and where they go. So it's not opposed to them. He just starts different. It doesn't contradict them. It doesn't go against them. It just starts different, because he doesn't start with Jesus being born. Then it also contains the story of John the Baptist. It contains the story of the beginning of his ministry, which all the others have. It's really the differentiation there of the description of Jesus than the other Gospels. Well, why? Why did he choose to be different and write it so different than them? And I think he was I think he was seeing a difficulty in the church of that time. The church, when it first began, as we look at the book of Acts and the early churches forming, they did a lot of their teaching and preaching in the synagogues and public places near the temple in Jerusalem. That was the practice of what was happening a lot in the book of Acts. It would start to move, though, when the temple fell. They no longer had that place. Now they were also scattered, and he's living in Ephesus. Without the temple worship, Judaism was changing. And by this time, the church, apart from the synagogue, was forming. And what you had now was an independent church away from the synagogues and the temple, that connection forming, and they were different. And there was something I think he was seeing that he's trying to address in the book of John, and that God's leading him to address in the book of John, because it's very powerful if you look at it. Because the early church, when it first formed, and it starts to form in the book of Acts, meets in people's houses. It started teaching in the synagogues. It started teaching in the street, the marketplace, reaching people, and it moved into people's houses. And it went from people's houses to meeting in a house. The first churches were houses, and it would be owned by the group, and they would meet there, they would study there, and they would also take and commune there a bit. You know, they took some of the common property, put it there to help people that were within the church. And they were starting to form in the book of Acts. And now that is more prominent by the time he's writing this in Ephesus. There was a church there, and probably multiple churches, of course, in Ephesus for them to meet in, and he's seeing a problem there. And I think he's looking at what the problem is. And I think the difficulty that was happening there becomes a question. I think it's a question. The question is, who is Jesus? I believe that's the question that John is looking to tackle, because he sees that the church in his time is struggling with that question. And who better to answer that question than the closest disciple and friend of Jesus Christ? Now, note for me, if you will, I'm not saying who is Jesus to me. I want you to know that. I'm not saying that. That is a question that is steeped in sort of secular humanism in practice. We were indoctrinated that in our schools. It populates our school system. We experience it. Anyone who's pretty much alive that's gone through the education system has been exposed to it. Now, granted, it's not like a Ten Commandments thing that's written there. It's subtle. It comes through the teachings that we learn as we go through school and as we take place. It's very minute. But we have to understand it makes us look at things sometimes in the wrong way. As a matter of fact, its most powerful piece that affects all of us, especially here in America, is when we ask that question of who is Jesus to me, we're really asking the question, what's in it for me? So we pick and choose. We pick and choose. But we can't make up our own answer for who is Jesus. We can't pick our pieces and put it together and answer that question, who is Jesus? The question and the answer stand apart from us alone. It exists even without us. And I believe that is where John is heading. Okay? That's what he's looking at doing in this Gospel of John. Also, I'm not asking the question, who was Jesus? Past tense. If you notice, as we investigated chapter 1, things were missing. I'm saying, didn't include the birth story. It didn't include the genealogy as far as that goes. And it wasn't in there. We're not looking at who was Jesus, because if we ask that question of who was Jesus, it can imply that Jesus is still in the grave, that Jesus doesn't exist. And, well, that's not true. Jesus exists. He's alive. He's on the throne, and that is how John is presenting him. That he is very much alive. And even today. Which now leads us to that question, who is Jesus? If we're going to ask it correctly. Meaning he is alive. And I believe that John very clearly spells out in his gospel that Jesus is alive even to us today. Almost everything he's going to teach is very applicable to us today. It is almost specific to us today that we can use what's taught about Jesus. But can you ask a more important question than who is Jesus? Can you have a harder question than who is Jesus? And how do you answer that question fully? Well, we look to the book of John. We look to the book of John. You have to understand, everyone has to answer that question. You're watching today, you'll answer that question, who is Jesus? But there's a lot of people who would say, well, I don't have to answer that question. I don't. Well, that is your answer to the question. By not answering it, you've chosen not to know Jesus. You've made your choice. But we all have to tackle that question. Who is Jesus? As a matter of fact, if you take that line of thinking and you take and examine it, you will come to understand who Jesus really is. If you just take and look and answer that question, who is Jesus? Not who he was, but who he is. That is very life-changing. That is a very powerful thing to do and brings many people to the understanding of who he is. As a matter of fact, many people just reading the book of John, because of how it's written in such a context that we understand it's real. Jesus is authentic. Jesus is who he is. And he's presented to us as a live being today, which he is, that it hits hard with people to know Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And it leads many to know Christ, many to be Christians, many to the understanding of who he is, because of how God inspired John to write this. It's very powerful. Now, what does John start with when he starts writing this gospel about Jesus? He didn't start with the nativity. He didn't start with the genealogy. He didn't start with the ministry. He started talking about Jesus' deity, about him being God. And I think that's why this central issue that was occurring in the church that day and in that time at Ephesus was focused on the deity of Christ. They were struggling with it. Now, it's a little different from our time. A lot of the eyewitnesses that saw Jesus were still alive. Matter of fact, John's one of them. But even the other people, think about all the people he healed. And whenever he healed somebody, they went away talking about him. They went away to community. Even if he said, don't tell anybody, they couldn't stop themselves. They still went and told people about Jesus Christ. It wouldn't stop them. It was contagious. So many of these people still existed and were still around, even outside the disciples, that had physically seen him. They had physically even probably touched him or been touched by him. Healed or met or whatever. The woman who touched the hem of his garment may have been alive and talking about it. The demoniac who had all the demons that was in the cemetery that had them all cast out may have been still in the countryside telling and testifying about Jesus Christ, and that he saw a man that cast it out of him. They were stuck on the humanity of Christ, I believe, because they still had eyewitnesses. You have to understand, there was people talking about, I know what Jesus looked like. I know what Jesus sounded like. I know what Jesus smelled like. Very tangible stuff about Jesus Christ that made it difficult, I believe, for them to see the deity of Christ because they were so caught up in his humanity. And John addresses it. John tackles it. John takes it head on when he starts writing his gospel, because you have to understand the church has been around for a little while. It's existed for a decent amount of time, and he's tackled it. He has accomplished now saying, okay, let me fix this question of who is Jesus so they can understand he is God and he's alive today. Because they, at that time especially, were struggling with it. We would not struggle as much with the humanity of Jesus today, but we do sometimes. We do. You can find churches today that when they teach a message on Jesus, they really exploit the human level of Jesus Christ. He gets us. Not a bad message, but you're focusing on the human part of Jesus. You need to also share the deity, because it's his deity that saved us. It's his deity that changes us. His humanity was to connect with us. His humanity was to be the sacrifice for us. But he had to be deity to save us. So we do have to take and keep that in perspective when we're looking at it. Now, I want to take a look at the first 5 verses there because it speaks of his deity in 3 simple ways as far as that goes. The first thing it says, Jesus has always existed. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God and was with God. You have to go back to Genesis 1:1 where it says, in the beginning was the Word. And this in the beginning appears in John 1. It also appears in 1 John chapter 1, verse 1. So he's really connecting Jesus to the beginning, that he was with God in that aspect of creation of Genesis 1:1, looking at it. Which leads me to the next one was Jesus was involved in creation. And he was. He took part in the Trinity of creation. It tells us there, all things came into being through him and has come into being. In him was life. Okay? So that's a very powerful principle to understand, those proclamations. He's eternal. Always existed. He was there when things were created and was a part of creating everything. And then there's a third thing that we're looking at too here is we were created for him. And verse 4, it says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend him. We were created for him, really. We were. And a powerful expression of his deity was his existence before things, involved in creating things, and that things were created us for him. So he is heavily linking to being God. He is. And what is our purpose then? What is his purpose? Humanity was his mission, to try and reach those who are lost. To save those that could be saved was his mission. And we have to understand that he undertook a very powerful mission to reach us. And a very important task to gather us, to die for us. And we're going to explore through this book of John that question of who is Jesus. I don't think you could ask a deeper question.